Grow CFO is where finance leaders grow together. Join thousands of like-minded professionals using Grow CFO to access the combined knowledge and experience of the finance leader community. You can join us today, growcfo.net.
Hello and welcome to the Grow CFO Show. I'm your host, Kevin Appleby, and today I've got a really interesting guest with me, Paul Achleitner. And Paul, I hope I've pronounced that name properly.
Close enough.
Paul, you are a very, very experienced leader in the boardroom. You're a former CFO. You've been around as chair in organizations such as Allianz, Deutsche Bank, and so on. And you're still, at the moment, carrying on with that boardroom activity. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Kevin, for having me. I'm born and raised in Austria, had most of my education in Switzerland and then subsequently in the United States. At some point, as a young man, I decided to emigrate to the United States, got my green card, worked for Bain & Company and Goldman in New York. And then somebody walked by my cubicle and said, "Hey, you, don't you speak some German?" And based on that brilliant career advice, I'm sitting here today talking to you. I moved with Goldman to London at the time of the Big Bang. I subsequently changed from Goldman in the year 2000 to become CFO of Allianz. In 2022, I actually became the chair of Deutsche Bank, which I did for 10 years, and I've stepped down in 2022. And since then, I've focused on personal investments, startup community, advisory mandates, board mandates, and I wrote this book.
Paul, you wrote a book. Tell us about it.
So why write a book these days? Which is a good question. Normally that's because people want to reflect on their own career. I do not. I hope that this book is focused on the future. It's based on observations that I made over the last 40 years. But why did I do this? To be honest, I was struck by the difference between the negativism that I experienced in many discussions with corporate executives in the Western world on the one hand, and the optimism of the startup community and the tech people that I have been interacting. And I was asking myself if that was simply due to naivete by the latter. And then, it occurred to me that it may actually have something to do with experience, but maybe slightly differently than what people would think now, because I think experience can actually be obsolete. And obsolete experience leads to insecurity and uncertainty. And maybe some of the negativism that we actually see and the critical attitudes and the lamenting that we find in many circles in Western Europe and maybe also more on the East Coast of the US has to do with being insecure about some of the new demands that are coming down the pipeline, which I call the legitimacy dimension. But I don't want to be too long-winded. That's essentially where I was deciding that maybe I can write a book, and maybe I can write the book so that people may actually be interested in reading it, which is 60 very short observations that always culminate in questions to the reader.
Yeah. And before this podcast, I got a hold of an advanced copy of the book and I flicked through a few chapters. And it's very short notice because literally we're recording this the day after the request came through for you to be on the show, Paul. But in that short time, I flicked through, read one or two of those chapters and got to the questions at the end. And actually, I really like that style of writing the book.
Well, thank you.
We haven't actually named the book. It's Accelerate Your Experience.
This is based on my conviction that you cannot transfer your experience to somebody else. Experience, by definition, is very subjective. And even if you and I go through the same situation, we will experience it differently, and the cumulative experience each one of us has is different. But what you can do is you can accelerate somebody else's experience. You can speed up their experience. You can challenge them by asking questions and thereby motivating them to reflect and gain experience through that process, rather than just listening to people who are actually talking about their own experience, which more often than not is a fertile exercise.
So who exactly is it written for?
I call it for aspiring and existing leaders.
Okay. So our audience of CFOs would fit right in there.
Absolutely. And I think particularly the observations that I have about legitimacy are issues that actually many of the CFOs might actually find quite interesting.
In your book, that says active corporate executives are often too busy to read books, and the startup generation is not that big into books. So, Paul, why have you written a book?
Because I structured it in a way that I just outlined it, 60-some observations, short 3 to 5 pages each, culminating in questions. So you go through the content and you actually pick and choose what piques your fancy. And you don't have to read the book from start to finish. By the way, once it comes out in an audio version, you can listen to this easily while you do your exercises. And you just check and find those topics that you find interesting. There are 60-some observations grouped in basically 3 categories, which are based on my, if you want to call it that, fancy word, conceptual framework, which I'm happy to go into, but I don't want to be too long-winded to your questions.
So maybe we ought to touch on that conceptual framework, Paul. Tell us a little bit about it.
So let's take a step back. I believe that leadership, which is one of my dimensions in today's world, is finding the right balance between the performance dimension and what I call the legitimacy dimension. Now, performance dimension is quite well known to all of us. It's everything that's quantifiable. If you want to, it is about true and false, and it's about facts. You measure performance. There is another dimension in today's world, however, that I call the legitimacy dimension, which is basically all about emotions, about like and dislike, and what other people think and feel about corporations, companies, individuals, and so on and so forth. And of course, in a world of social media and transparency driven by that, this dimension has become a very important factor. And if you are a leader, you have to find the right balance between performance and legitimacy, because if you fail in either one of them, you will endanger the company. If you're not performing well, of course, your legitimacy are gone because, you're in business to perform. But if you're actually performing well, but you lose your legitimacy, that will also challenge and may actually impede your performance going forward. I think that's in a nutshell. That's it.
Yeah. And we saw that social media thing big time a couple of weeks ago, where we had a company CEO spotted with his head of HR in a rather embarrassing situation at a Coldplay gig.
You see it all over the place and in many situations. And I think it's very interesting because most of us who are in leadership positions today grew up with the performance dimension. And they are comfortable in the performance dimension in all types, shapes, or forms. But the legitimacy dimension, which, by the way, comes intuitive to many of the startup guys and entrepreneurs, maybe accounting for some of the disparity that I described before, that legitimacy dimension is, if I want to call it that, an acquired taste for most people who grew up, and are now in serious leadership positions. Because you didn't have to deal with all of that, at least not in that level of depth.
And there is quite a difference there. And I think back to my own career in big corporate, chemical industry, in PwC, in the consulting industry. No, it was all based on performance. You needed to get a certain place in your annual review. You needed to demonstrate that you were performing at the next grade before anybody promoted you to it. Yet, you look at the startup leader, and in essence, it's a great idea that's been sold to other people. And once it's sold to other people, you attract investment and you get on with it. There's none of that huge length of time to build yourself up to that position of leadership.
I think you're exactly right. And even what constitutes performance gets redefined. I vividly remember already, 10 years ago when my youngest son was in some kind of entrepreneurship camp in California. And we would subsequently meet with some friends in the tech industry. And my son was like 9 at the time. And he was asked by my friend, he said, "So what is more important, growth or profit?" And my son immediately said, "Growth, of course." And before I could even start to correct him, he was already fist bumping with my friend. And my friend turned to me and said, "See, your son is getting it." Okay. So I grew up in a world where, as the saying was, revenues are vanity profits are sanity and cash is reality. And then, of course, suddenly some of these dimensions get shifted.
Yeah. And I think we've seen that in a lot of organizations now where we're growing and becoming a certain size is much more important than ever registering a profit.
Yes. And that is why I think it is also important that we recognize, on the one hand, that some of our experience may be obsolete. But on the other hand, we don't just go for the newest fad because we've been around the block and have seen one or two things, and that moderates maybe the exuberance that sets in at some corners.
Yeah. But now, Paul, you're looking back and drawing lessons into this book from a career of many years. There have been a lot of changes over that time, and I imagine that you and I started in the workplace at a time not a lot different to each other, and we've seen the takeover of the PC, we've seen the takeover of the internet, but there's a takeover going on at the moment from AI that's going way faster than either of those. So if you think about that experience as leadership, is that experience relevant coming forward into this new age?
So there is a whole chapter on obsolete experience, okay, and the danger of obsolete experience. I'm trying to be very cognizant of the fact that my own experience dates also from a time that may actually have been the best time in history ever. Okay, we had no global wars and conflicts. We had globalization in terms of trades. We had deregulation. We had global capital markets. There was a lot of opportunity for folks like me who come from a small town in Austria and pursue your dreams and opportunities. And I think I'm very cognizant of the fact that many of the challenges we face today are not only different, but they are very significant. And they cannot be solved with the same tools. Having said that, there are many observations that I think that the likes of us have made over time that, if appropriately presented, may actually help to, quote unquote, accelerate other people's experience so that they don't have to make the same mistakes that we made.
How do you see that playing out, though, into a world that is changing so rapidly with tech? Don't make the same mistakes we made.
Well, let's take a step back. What is it in a world of AI where knowledge and facts will be at your fingertips that humans will actually continue to have to contribute? It's judgment. Judgment is going to be one of the most important elements that you can bring to the party. Now, very often than not, judgment is associated with experience. Now, in today's world, you making your own experience may not advance your own experience curve fast enough. You should actually look for opportunities to accelerate your own experience. And I guess it was Bismarck who said, any fool can learn from his own mistakes. The wise man learns from somebody else's. So I think to have the intellectual curiosity, which is very important, to have the ability to listen rather than broadcast, because I think we live in a world where everybody is trying to just broadcast. And if you talk, hopefully you're not learning anything new. So it may be a good idea to actually listen, attentively listen, and try to understand other people and other perspectives. And some of my observations go in all these directions.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're going to have to cope with as leaders going forward is probably managing change on a scale we've never had to before. So what advice do you have on managing that change process?
Okay, so maybe let's start with what I call the fertility of black swans. Just accept the fact that there are going to be more black swans happening and coming than you would ever have expected. Live with the inevitability of unintended consequences. And then I think one other aspect is that I call the consequence of being wrong. What do I mean by that? I think the essence of risk management can be distilled to the simple question, what is the consequence of being wrong? I've sat through endless hours, months, years of risk committees in all kinds of institutions with all the great tools that we have developed, the quantitative models and everything else, and probabilities and so on and so forth. But if you all boil it down, it comes down to the simple question, what happens if you are wrong? Is this just a marginal impact on next quarter's earning? Is this a fundamental challenge to your earnings? Is this an existential crisis? Is this a personal career risk? What is it if you actually are wrong? And not what's the probability that you are wrong? That's fine. But people can get all eased out with low probabilities and so on and so forth. The essence is, what happens if you're wrong? And I think particularly if you're a CFO, you want to deal with that. And that's one of the things that matters in the future as much as in the past, and is definitely another very important element. I don't want to go on too much, but I think another principle that I, in the book, call the control of strong egos is very simple. All of us who are in leadership positions have strong egos. The simple question is, do you control your ego, or does your ego control you?
Now, that is a very interesting question. And certainly in a time where nothing's going to be quite like it used to be, how much of that ego is going to drive us to the wrong position?
So I think you can argue that strong egos have always advanced innovation, history, what have you, but they've also caused a lot of damage. And I think the important element, particularly in a corporate environment, is that even the strongest ego needs some kind of balancing counterforce. I also write about what I call the drug of charismatic leadership. We have a tendency to just want to have charismatic leaders and so on and so forth. I think leadership is much more than one individual. People often confuse charisma and competence. I think beyond individuals, you actually need a structure in order to have, and a culture in order to have an effective leadership in an institution. And that is particularly pertinent to CFOs, who actually are responsible for a large part of that structure. You need compliance, you need a board, you need a strong chair who keeps egos under control. All of these elements are very important, including a culture. And in my definition, corporate culture is what people do when nobody watches.
Yeah. Actually, I like those thoughts on charismatic leadership. Because if you're in a situation with a lot of change going along and you've got to take your team with you, then a charismatic leader is ideal to do that. People will follow that person. But I love what you've said about controlling that leadership with the team around about. And possibly the chair is there, not as the charismatic person, but as the sensible person, almost the referee. The CFO's there to give good, partial, impartial financial advice, direct help with strategy and so on. But then the charismatic leader takes people forward with the vision.
One of my observations is that there are two types of managers, and it's not just types, it's maybe two ends of dimensions, but artists and operators. And what you need is the right kind of mixture. And most people, if you ask them, they will say they want to be artists. But the problem is, if you have an organization led only by artists, you're going to be in problem. You need operators. And if you're a smart artist, you will team up with operators. And the best operators are those who are very comfortable with the fact that they're operators and they are authentic. I mean, one of the biggest issues in leadership is authenticity. And if you're an artist, you can pretend to be an operator. If you're an operator pretending to be an artist, just because you put on white sneakers doesn't make you to be a big tech guru. And you can see how these dynamics around these two poles of managerial dimensions are playing out differently in different companies and are impacting career paths as well as the culture of companies.
I think it's actually fascinating as you look at most startups. It's quite common that you'll be focused on one person that will call themselves the founder. And I think they probably are more or less that artistic person you described there. But in so many of those companies, actually the founding team, there'll be two or possibly more individuals. And the founder who's putting the vision in place, who's having the ideas, will need that really good tech person to put the systems in place, the structures in place behind all of that stuff.
I totally agree. It is even worse if you actually have, sometimes you actually have startups that are driven by a guy who is just a brilliant mind. He's an operator, he's a coder, he is really into the nitty-gritty of his or her product. And Then at some point in time, venture capitalist board members come and say, hey, you got to go out there, you got to talk to people because we want to do another fundraise or whatever. Sometimes these people are horrified by the idea. And then after a while, they start to love it. So suddenly you finally see them out there giving one speech after another, being on one panel after another. If you're a venture capitalist or if you're an investor, and you start getting press clippings, okay, instead of technical reports or revenue reports or whatever, you know you're in trouble. Yeah. So you got to find the right mixture.
I see an analogy there. Just thinking about the rock band. No, the lead singer gets all the credit.
Yeah.
You get nowhere without a good drummer and a bass player.
You're exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So, Paul, one of the things that we find with new CFOs in particular is being promoted into the position of leadership for the first time, having to become the advisor to the CEO, the head of finance, having to talk to investors, to suppliers, to customers. What we typically see is the crisis of confidence and this thing we generally call imposter syndrome. How would you look at those things in a world that by definition is right now very uncertain?
So I think, first of all, if you are a leader, and it doesn't matter if you're the CEO or if you're a CFO, you want to also pay attention to what I call the seductiveness of convincing narrators. Okay, people who tell a great story. And they come and they tell you a great story. And in today's world of PowerPoints, which are basically little cheat sheets so that you can deliver your sermon, and the smart guy says, why don't you hold the questions until I'm through? And then people don't want to go back to page 3 and say, well, the footnote down there, how does that? Once they have already delivered their grandiose conclusions. You want to be very thoughtful and very careful about that. I always remember when I was CFO of Allianz, we had our strategic dialogues with the various subsidiaries who came to headquarters and presented their performance, where they wanted to go, what they wanted to do. The star performers every year were the CEOs of the American subsidiary. The guys that we struggled most with was the one guy in the 12 years that I was there from Spain. Year after year, Spain was the total outperformer. And I've, in the 12 years, seen about 5 or 6 different CEOs of what used to be called Fireman's Fund, which doesn't, I believe, even exist today. But these guys were all telling a great story. And every time you went out there and said, okay, he only needs a few $100 million of investments, no problem. Right? And of course, if you're a CFO, you're going to say, hold on your fire. Great story, but where are the facts? At the end, it's all about the power of excellent execution. Excellent execution can make up for a deficiency in strategy, but no brilliant strategy can make up for deficiencies in execution. So I think if you are a CFO, you want to pay attention to exactly that, okay? And if I may add another thought, which may sound a little clip, but as they say, the only thing that can beat artificial intelligence is human stupidity. And I have a chapter in there that's called The Reliability of Human Stupidity.
Oh, come on. Tell me more about that.
That
sounds like one I should have read.
See, the thing is this. Something happens, you got a problem, you got a legitimacy crisis. Most people out there don't know how to deal with thousands of people, hundreds of millions, or even billions of investments and other good things. But what they can relate to is human misbehavior. If one individual behaves stupidly, they can relate to that and they will leech onto it. And the press will be on it and the broader media, and you'll get shitstorms and you get this or that. And there is inevitably in every crisis a situation where you say, how could XYZ be so stupid? It happens because humans are humans and they will make stupid mistakes. By the way, the important thing is how you deal with a mistake, because as some smart politician once said to me, second move kills. Very often you get judged more in terms of how you actually handle the situation rather than by the original mistake. But nevertheless, you can rely on human stupidity. There will be stupid mistakes no matter what you do.
So stupid mistakes can beat AI.
Yeah. I'd say maybe a little clip, but it's the stuff you need to look for because that's what people will take into focus because they can relate to it.
That's provoking some really interesting thoughts, Paul.
Good.
Yeah. So there's a term that I spotted as I flicked through the book that kind of maybe fits into this. You mentioned on more than one occasion, muddling through.
Huh.
Now, that doesn't sound like something that a great leader should be doing, just muddling through.
I think the answer is recognize the realities of muddling through. Recognize that strategies are great, but you will have to improvise as you go forward. Recognize that it's quite interesting. People are full of praise for agile companies. But if you actually would substitute opportunism for agility, people would say, "Oh, what, you got an opportunistic strategy? What does that mean?" Now, you tell me what the difference is between optimism and agility. I'm not sure I know. So I think we're being a little unrealistic in terms of how we're idealistic in the way that we describe the advance of certain developments and so on and so forth. I think it was Stephen Jobs who said the dots can only be connected in hindsight. This is like on a personal level, my career only looks like it was built up. It was a sequence of accidental opportunities that arose in the way that I described this before. And many times when people look at quote unquote successful strategies, there's a lot of reinterpretation of history because somebody came up with an innovation, had an idea that got advanced. In other cases, really brilliant ideas got squashed. And in hindsight, then people turn this into a brilliant execution of a strategy. But in reality, a lot of it is muddling through.
I'll right back in the introduction, you were talking about your career and talking about how being able to speak German made a career decision for you. And it occurred to me, and I look back over my own career and think how much of it was planned, how much of it was just being in a certain place at a certain time. And I also look at business strategy almost in the same way, because you don't know what the world's going to be like in 3 years, in 5 years' time, yet we love coming up with a 5-year strategy.
So when I was a young academic, I had the pleasure to work for a professor called Igor Antsov. He was one of the pioneers of strategic management. As a matter of fact, some people think he coined the term strategic management. Doesn't really matter. He was a great guy, very interesting guy. And then he said to me one day, "Paul, let me explain strategy to you so that even you can understand it." You can see he actually had a very high opinion of me. But he said, and I can say this here on this podcast because English is nicely gender neutral. He said, it's like you have a preference for blondes, which means you're going to go into a bar and you're going to scan the bar for blondes. If you sit at the bar and this very good looking redhead comes and asks you if you want to have a drink together, if you say, "Buzz off, I'm only interested in blondes," you're not a strategist, you're an idiot. And I think it graphically described what you had just also lined out. You got to seize opportunities. And one of my favorite quote is from Seneca: "Luck is when preparedness meets opportunity."
Yeah, I think strategy boils down to just a decision of this is what we're going to do, this is what we're not going to do. Simple as that.
The most important thing may actually be the decision of what not to do. I think one of the most important roles of strategy is, in a world of plenty, in a world of huge complexity, to reduce that complexity and allow you to focus on a smaller perspective and smaller opportunities than scouting the world for everything.
Yeah. So it really is the stop-start decision.
Focus matters.
So, Paul, you mentioned earlier in the conversation about your son going off and onto an entrepreneurship course. But looking at the book now, if you were going to take out of those 60 lessons, 2 or 3 of them, which ones would they be that you're passing on to those people as close as that to your sons?
So I think the first one I would pick is the illusion of satisfactory underperformance. Be aware of the illusion of satisfactory underperformance. I believe that we as individuals, but also institutions, and maybe even societies, have a tendency of viewing our performance as quite satisfactory. as long as it is better than last year's or the one of the immediate colleague or competitor that we compare ourselves. But if that performance is actually an underperformance relative to the potential that is inherent in you as an individual or in the institution, more often than not gets not discovered. So you can live very comfortably for quite a while without actually pushing yourself hard enough to actually go out there and be successful. And you do that, okay, you're just slightly above average and it'll lead to mediocrity. And that's a problem.
So don't settle for somebody saying, yep, that's a good job.
Exactly.
Be pushing for somebody saying, oh, that's a great job.
Yes. Now, you may even want to be sure that the person who says that is somebody who actually is discriminatory and tough enough to actually give you the right message.
Yeah. I know that you've got that chapter on underperformance.
Yes.
Then that's followed immediately by a chapter on overperformance.
Very observant of you. You're exactly right. So I have, for a long time in my life, been very fascinated with and focused on never falling into the illusion of satisfactory underperformance. But I've also come to recognize, which, by the way, has a lot to do with benchmarking. But I've also realized that particularly in the world in which we now live in, where there's a lot of transparency all the way to the social media, there is the risk of the wrong benchmarking. And therefore, I call my second observation in this context the deception of sustainable overperformance. Let me actually put this in very simple terms. You can only defy gravity for so long until organizations fail or people burn out. So finding the right balance as an individual, but also as a leader for the institution between short-term risk of overperformance and the longer-term risk of underperforming is another of the leadership challenges that I think we have today, and we will continue to have that going forward.
I remember back in my first big organization, ICI, which sadly no longer exists,
Yes.
we had this framework by which people were promoted and moved through the ranks, and by showing that almost consistent overperformance, you got to quite a senior position. And I recall now that we used to laugh and say that everybody in this company gets promoted to their level of incompetence.
Which is one of the biggest issues. The Peter Principle, I think, is in action. Any which way you look, you'll see it in institutions, in corporates, you see it in politics, you see it all around. And it continues to be one of the biggest issues or one of the biggest human challenges that we actually have in the leadership dimension, no question. But that also has to do maybe with another thing that I am asking people and also asking my sons. I start the whole book with what I call the prerequisite of adding value. Companies are there because there's a social contract that brings something to the party. Individuals work for companies because they bring something to the party. So unless what you consider to be adding value may change over time, and customer tastes change, what you actually had to offer as a company may no longer be what it used to be. You as an individual came in, you were delivering a lot, but you were kind of like fading. So I think one of the most important things you can do as an individual, but also as a leader of a company, is to consistently challenge yourself. Am I still adding value? Because it's way better you are asking this question than other people start asking it for you.
Indeed. And I've seen a debate that's emerging quite a lot lately, going back to CFOs.
Yeah.
Is the CFO becoming not the chief financial officer, but the chief value officer?
Yeah, I think, but again, in that context, it's very important that CFOs get actually comfortable with, quote unquote, the legitimacy dimension. And therefore, I really recommend they read my book.
Which is a really great link back to the book. So the book, remind us of the title.
Accelerate Your Experience.
And it's published on
August the 21st.
So not sure at the moment whether you'd be listening to this podcast just before the book is published or just after the book is published. But I've seen an advanced copy. I've read a little bit of it. I like what I'm reading. I really would recommend this book to you. And Paul, it has been a pleasure having you on this podcast today. Thank you for being a guest on the Grow CFO Show.
I thank you, and I hope anybody who picks up your challenge and the book will enjoy it. I had fun writing it. Thank you.